as measurement and beyond. Now they've all been broken up and put into fence posts, so there are none standing left in New England, but there was records of where they were originally. And I showed this the other day, the Rhode Island Tower, the Newport Tower, which is a matter of particular speculation. Now it's open on the top. It may have had a wooden standing roof up there, but it looks like really like an observation tower. Now whether it was Norse or whether, as Menzies says, one of the Chinese astronomical posts, that's not known. They really don't know where this thing came from. And again, it goes from there on into fantastic speculation that there's a Chinese text from the 1500s which describes people who live far in the north and have no plants. They eat raw meat and they live in ice houses. And the only people that could be like that are the Inuit up in Greenland and northern Canada. And so this may be an example of somebody was there and came back and described it in Chinese. Now on the other side of the globe, if you take a ship around South Africa and then you go up the coast, you'll catch the counter circulation of the South Atlantic currents, and it's very easy to sail down the coast of South America all the way down into the, let's say, the colder zones. And so here's a curious chart that is in the Topkapi Museum in Istanbul of Piri Reis, the Admiral Reis of the Ottoman Empire, and he commissioned many charts of the known world, but this one is curious because it's now north is off to the left here, so that's Spain and Gibraltar's there, and that's Africa, and the rest is the South American coast. Now this dates from 1512, before Magellan went down there, and it's curious because you have descriptions of bays and features in Arabic all the way down to the tip of South America, and there is ice like this, but again, it parallels what we know of that area, but then again, who was there to know about that, and who would bring it all the way back to Istanbul? I don't think it was a Turkish sailor. So again, Menzies thinks it was the Chinese who came and had some other charts. They eventually were second or third hand informed to the drawing of this particular chart. But alas, none of them survived other than a few sort of delicious tidbits of speculation perhaps. But if any Chinese explorers went out or they established any bases or colonies out there, they all disappeared, either by hostile natives or just the hardships of being out in a place where they were not familiar. And they either intermarried, perhaps DNA evidence will prove or disprove some of the speculation, but the relief never came because the whole effort of China then came to a sudden halt. There was this chart that came by a collector, and it was said to be a 1763 copy of a 1418 original of Zheng He's own commission. Now these records were lost in China itself, but in, let's say, the incursion and the ravaging of Chinese libraries, which went on for a couple hundred years, this particular chart was traded by collectors and then ended up in the hands of a collector who revealed it. Now, it has been called a fake by other scholars, but if it's not fake, it is quite remarkable that it shows all the continents and much of the world as we know it, well before European cartography was this, however inaccurate, was developed. And so this is another point of contention that scholars are debating and studying. But it's certainly well known that the Chinese then pulled back. There was turmoil in the empire. There was famine and flooding and all the usual troubles that China has, uprisings. But particularly ominous was the striking of the new imperial palace by lightning that burned a few of the newly constructed buildings. And then Zhu Di himself led an army up to subdue an incursion from the Mongols and died in Mongolia. And his successor was his young son, but had a regent and a bureaucracy that did not want to spend any more valuable resources on this exploration, especially the cost of the building the ships. And so there was an order that came from Beijing to close the shipyard, to seize all the documents, to lay off all of the workers, and then not go out there anymore. So at this point, China turned inward, where it might have continued with more of its exploration or development of its trade or even colonies around the world. And so that meant that China came into a period of, let's say, isolation and pride, but not international extension. And then, of course, the world changed in many other ways. If you go to Beijing, you can see this, the marble boat, which when China was semi-colonized by the various powers, the Chinese government thought it should have a modern navy, and the Empress Xuxi commissioned instead a tea house on the the Summer Palace, and it's there to this day if you've been there. But that's the sort of attitude that the imperial government of China had. They just didn't need to bother with the cost or the trouble of a navy or send the trading vessels out. And so China's been, until just recently, had very little of a merchant navy at all, much less a international navy in a military sense. But nonetheless, the innovations are still historically true. The development of charts, the post-rudder, the bulkhead construction, and above all, the compass. And so without these developments, even the Europeans probably couldn't have done what was then in the next couple of centuries, expand knowledge and commerce around the world. And of course, when the Portuguese were, let's say, at the end of the trade chain, particularly after the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans, then there was a great impetus to get vessels that could go out and trade with Asia. So that was, of course, the goal of all the explorers. But the Portuguese had a nimble caravel construction, paralleling the larger Chinese ships somewhat, but they also developed the Lateen rig, which is the standard now called a Marconi rig for sailboats, but that's much more nimble than square sails or much less the lug sail of the Chinese. But then the compass was developed, and then also the astrolabe, celestial navigation, and this was the great study of Prince Henry's navigation school in Sagres, Portugal. And then you can postulate, did Columbus and the rest follow where the Chinese led? And of course, there's maybe more information buried in various archives, but this is mostly the speculation of this gentleman, Gavin Menzies, who went on to publish another book. The first one that promoted a lot of this was 1421, which was translated into Chinese, and he was a greeted with great hospitality and acclaim in academic circles in China, but he's been greatly dismissed in British and other historical circles as neither trained in this nor rigorous in his confirmation of his speculations. And so it's been called junk history by others, but you can look it up. He's still doing it and still trying to get more information, and has a public call for more archaeological evidence here. But his latest book, 1434, was particularly out on the limb because he said that he found evidence and documentation that a Chinese delegation came from China, ended up in Egypt, and then went to Italy, and then transmitted some of their technological papers and demonstrations to Leonardo da Vinci. The problem is that there's no evidence in either da Vinci's files or the Italian history of the time that there ever a Chinese delegation ever came. So this is where he's been somewhat dismissed by other scholars as more imaginative than accurate. But again, there may be more evidence someday. Meanwhile, Zheng He is still a great hero of the Chinese nation. And here's a tour boat out of Singapore. And so all school children all through Asia now learn about this great period of exploration. And now the Chinese nation has also a great development of their own contemporary capabilities at sea. So I say here, You Hai Shang, which means back to sea. And this is a great signal tower in Dalian, which is an example of how large the fleet has become, and the assertion of claims on their own territorial waters, especially South China Sea. But COSCO, the Chinese overseas shipping company, is now the world's largest cargo fleet on the Yangtze River. There are the world's largest shipyards on outside of Shanghai. And then I say piracy in modern ways. There's been a problem with some of the piracy of Southeast Asia. Ships are delivered into Chinese shipyards where they're repainted and reflagged. And then the Chinese Navy is growing quickly, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. But here's just a view of some of the ports. If you've sailed the coast of China, you can see nice little fishing villages like Dalian, and then Tianjin, that's the main port for Beijing, and Shanghai, of course, on the Huangpu River, which is just packed with shipping. But the larger shipping is out on the Pudong side on the ocean, because big ships cannot get into the river. So this is where we normally land on a larger vessel, and you can see it's just sort of the world's biggest parking lot and container port. It's now larger than Rotterdam. But the commerce is going so quickly that the ship left before the containers could be secured on the deck, it seems. Anyway, it's a booming place, and notice the air quality. I had to quit working in China because I was getting too ill from it, from just being there. And so I resigned my commission many years ago now. I visit every year, but I can't live in that air, literally. But nowadays, of course, this is the study of economics and strategy. China has become a net importer of oil and is a voracious consumer of Middle Eastern resources. And so this is the critical point for the economy and also for security, that China guarantee its oil supplies. And they're building depots in Burma and to short-circuit the circuit through Singapore and such, so that China will continue to have enough oil. And then to protect the sea lanes, they have begun to develop their own navy. They started off by buying 2 old Russian Kirov-class carriers, one of which became a karaoke hotel feature attraction in the port in Canton, Guangzhou, which is a good use for an aircraft carrier, a big dance floor. Why not? And if you pay your taxes. When I was in Dalian, the northern port, and I went out to see the other Kirov-class aircraft carrier, and I was on a bicycle. I went and took these pictures, and they saw me taking these pictures, and they called the police, and they couldn't catch me. I was on a bicycle through all the containers and got back to my ship and got away. But meanwhile, that has been commissioned now, and it is an operant aircraft carrier, and now they're building a new one, all of Chinese construction. So this is where China wants to catch up with others that have battle fleets out there. I can't think of any other country that has battle fleets, but I'm sure there's one somewhere. But this is how the Kirov decks are. They have this sort of lift bow or takeoff. And now some people say these are the big floating, sitting ducks out in the ocean. It's folly in the days of modern satellite and missile technology to even have any ships this size. But nonetheless, the Chinese Navy and Army and Air Force are developing all the capabilities of a global power, including a very large fleet of frigates, destroyers. And you can read about this in the military press, that there's a lot of concern that the Chinese Navy will be big enough to control all of its own local territory. This was the first time a Chinese destroyer came in to visit a port in the U.S. in Seattle. And so as long as there's peaceful relations, this is all just for fun. But the Chinese nation, of course, is very patriotic and very full of desire to make up for past injustices and grievances and show its abilities to the world. So that's where they've been building all of these vessels and developing their technology as much as they can. And hopefully it is all just for peacekeeping and there won't be any scraps. But they're also building submarines, and there's a lot of cat and mouse all over the Asian waters with these capabilities. And especially, perhaps more vital than the bigger fleets out at sea, are these landing crafts that they've been building, and with the capability of going offshore and then landing somewhere. Now, I used to live in Taiwan and work there, and the joke there at the time was that if the Chinese Navy and Army ever tried to get over to Taiwan, first of all, they couldn't find it because the pollution's so bad, and the cities are so crowded and the traffic's so bad they can never get into town. They just give up, go to lunch, and everybody would be happy. But meanwhile, they're building what they call a mosquito fleet of torpedo boats, fast chase boats. And so the Chinese Navy strategists say that in any case, they will be able to swarm the sea with all of these small vessels, including stealth vessels. When I was looking this up online, though, as soon as I got to this picture, my computer crashed. So be careful what you poke into online. But these are all up and down the coast of China, these sort of fast stealth attack boats. So the Chinese Navy has been describing their defense strategy in 2 lines. The first island line from Kyushu, Japan, down into the South China Sea, where they claim right up to the beaches of Philippines and Malaysia and Vietnam, and you can read about the disputes there right now. But then the second line is from central Honshu, Japan, down to farther out into Indonesia, and that's a real question. The Philippines and others do not want to be encased in a Chinese security bubble, but this is the debate of the days. So the other side of this is that the Chinese have developed a space technology, which comes very much out of maritime technology. And Mr. Yuan was the first Chinese up in space as space flight, and they're planning soon a trip to the moon. They launched an exploratory probe to the moon just the other day. And they are part of the International Space Station. So, as I say, to boldly go where no Chinese have been before, they also have polar research and a lot of technical capability, which surprises people. And in the, at least for the International Space Station, the Chinese participation has greatly improved the quality of the food in outer space. So that's a good thing. Now I'm going to just leave you with this old Chinese saying, which is 8 immortals cross the sea, and the full proverb is 八仙过海,各种各通, which means 8 spiritual celestial deities went across the seas and they found their way back, but each one had their own capabilities and their own experience that they could share when they got back. And so that's a metaphor when you go on an ocean voyage, especially, that it's not the voyage itself that is of interest, it's what you can bring back for your family and your nation in the sense of knowledge and friendship. And so that's a valuable saying in Chinese when you go traveling, that you grow yourself and you grow your community by the experience. And here's another example. There are many descriptions of the magical powers of the 8 immortals that cross the sea, just like all of us, right? And this is a contemporary junk rig vessel, which I work with, the Heraclitus, which is, again, that marine research vessel that does slow sailing for trawling for plankton and other marine creatures, the laboratory down below. But again, that lug rig is very convenient in a rough sea because we just drop it down to whatever sections we need. It's not a very fast vessel, but it is very much in the tradition of the Chinese maritime construction, a very shallow hull but broad so that it can carry a lot but can go into shallow waters. And I leave you a couple of websites here of the ship itself. It is owned by an organization based in London called Ecotechnics, which researches environmental issues and solutions, and that's Ecotechnics. And then my other little vessel, the Clang 2, and then my email, and then I invite you all for your brief day in New York, if you're there, to come by our old Sailor's Pub down in Soho and Spring Street, which is 200 years old, and lunch and dinner every day. It has a Chinese kitchen and an Irish bar, and our motto is, as long as the Chinese don't drink and the Irish don't cook, it'll go on forever, which it already has. Anyway, I'll be back there tomorrow. Come for lunch if you have time. And with that, I just leave you Yifan Feng Shun, which means may you always have a following wind. And it's my great pleasure to be here on this great ship with you, and I wish you all a bon voyage. Thank you very much. Thank you.